They told me the sitter blinked when the lights went out. The guard laughed, until the conservator found 21st century titanium white under a 17th century glaze. Somewhere behind a locked door at the Louvre, a portrait smile was lying. Paris, winter light like thin glass over the Seine. And inside the Louvre, a corridor most visitors never see. Concrete floors, humming ducts, and a coded door labeled MNR, a designation tied to works with complicated provenance after World War II. Two rooms for recovered paintings were formally announced in press materials in recent years, a reminder that museums live with ghosts as well as masterpieces. Camille Durand had worked 8 years in technical imaging, building spectral maps of varnish and pigment the way geologists map fault lines. In the art world, authentication can swing a painting from millions to nearly worthless, a tenfold collapse not unheard of when attribution fails. The market's fragility, case studies warn, is a feature, not a bug. The portrait had arrived quiet, a Spanish school nobleman in severe black, lace collar caught like frost at his throat, catalogued decades ago as Circle of Murillo, then relabeled in the 1980s as Workshop of Murillo, a distinction that sounds academic until insurers and boards start calling. France has seen what happens when provenance, power, and museums intersect. Curators questioned, wills contested, and works at the center of controversy. But this one wasn't in a gilded gallery. It was in a hidden room where curators keep the works that need answers. Camille's first glance caught a hairline crack running too cleanly through the cheek and another along the cuff. Crackle that looked arranged. In recent forgery scandals, artificial aging has been used by warming panels to induce history. The guard, Ben, liked to linger. "You know they say there's a door nobody admits exists," he said, grinning, "and a work so famous they'd sooner hide it than admit it's not what they said. Museums have their hidden stories. That part at least is true." Camille began with non-invasive scans, infrared reflectography to peer through the paint skin, and macro X-ray fluorescence to fingerprint elements across the sitter's face and lace. In notorious old master scandals, the scientific dossier often does the talking first. Modern binders, anachronistic pigments, and signatures that fluoresce too eagerly under UV. The first result arrived with the quiet ping of the lab terminal. Elevated titanium and highlights along the lace and the eye's catchlight. Titanium white, particularly rutile stabilized with alumina or silica, became common only in the 20th century. To find it inside a purported 17th century stratigraphy is like catching a wristwatch in a period portrait. Camille cross-checked against the museum's own files. The portrait entered via a bequest in 1985, guided by experts who were later scrutinized in press investigations about acquisitions and provenance tangles tied to wealthy estates and contested documents. The past is not dead in museums. It sits on racks with registration tags. Camille lifted the frame and found a faint graphite inscription on the stretcher. D'après, French for after, followed by a barely visible monogram. For centuries, copies after masters circulated honestly. The crime begins when a copy is dressed as an original and smuggled through catalogs with doctored paperwork, a pattern seen across high-profile forgery rings. Tension peak 1. Under UV, the varnish bloomed unevenly, with islands of retouching, pulsing electric. A cross-section sample from a lifting flake at the collar, documented under the lab's strict chain of custody, revealed a sandwich of old and new. A convincingly aged support, a traditional ground, then a modern overpaint designed to ride on top of a genuine but lesser workshop layer. These hybrid deceptions are particularly pernicious. They blur the line between restoration and falsification. The paper trail had its own crackle. A typed receipt on yellowing stock claimed the portrait was transferred from a private Parisian collection in 1941, then restituted in 1948. Dates pressing against France's darkest years, when art seizures and post-war returns spawned the M&R designation, and later the Louvre's dedicated rooms to address these histories. The museum's public notes about these rooms emphasize transparency about World War II-era recoveries. But a conservator's truth must be double-sourced. Camille called in an external chemist who had worked on the chronic Venus controversy in France, where a 213-page report flagged warmed panels and synthetic anachronisms. He reviewed Camille's spectra and nodded grimly at the titanium spikes. Tension peaked too. In a late-night session, Ben confided a rumor about a shadow inventory kept to avoid scandal. Work set aside until lawyers and insurers could align. The idea isn't pure fiction. Reporting has chronicled hidden spaces and quiet standoffs over attribution and display, from Salvator Mundi's Contested Science to museum drawers that rarely see daylight. By January 13, 2025, Camille had compiled a dossier: pigment maps, cross-sections, UV mosaics, and a timeline tying the portrait's modern interventions to a likely late 20th century forgery workshop operating in Europe, the kind that seeded old master lookalikes into blue-chip channels and left institutions red-faced years later. Curators have called such episodes collective failures of expertise. She presented to the acquisitions committee in a room of breathing air vents and narrowed eyes. The legal counsel quoted a paper on the risk landscape. When a fake is proven in certain jurisdictions, destruction may be mandated. Insurers fret over precedent, and public trust is the currency that matters most. Outside, Paris rains stippled the pyramid. Inside, the portrait seemed to smirk behind its glaze, a palimpsest of someone else's ambition, wearing a lie the way the sitter wore lace. How many truths in museums are just best available stories waiting for better tools? The art market punishes uncertainty. Dealers, collectors, and institutions sometimes prefer a coherent tale to an unresolved anomaly. The twist arrived not in the paint but in the paper. A Freedom of Information style request turned up a post-war dossier noting a different portrait, similar dimensions, similar sitter, flagged as a potential restitution case that never cleared verification. The object ID numbers diverged by a single transposed digit. In bureaucracies, a typo can be a Trojan horse. Cross-checking, Camille found that the restituted narrative attached to this canvas piggybacked on that unresolved claim, a classic laundering tactic. Solder a fake to a real story from 1941 to 48, then let time do the rest. The titanium and UV evidence weren't just about a forger's chemistry. They were about a paper forger's ear for believable tragedy. Legal convened an emergency session. If the underlayer was workshop authentic, but the face and lace had been modernized into a master, the object was both artifact and fraud. Options: disclose and reclassify, remove overpaint where reversible, or, if statutes demand, deaccession and potentially destroy altered elements after full documentation, a path some European laws contemplate for proven forgeries. Camille proposed a different ending: conserve transparently, publish the lab book, and display the portrait in the very rooms dedicated to returned histories, this time as a case study in how lies hitch rides on real suffering. The committee, wary but persuaded, voted to reattribute to After Murillo, composite object with modern falsifications, the kind of sober label that dings value but restores integrity. In the hidden room, Ben stood with Camille as the portrait, now half-cleaned, revealed a plainer, gentler sitter beneath a false bravado. "He looks more human," Ben said. Maybe that was always the point. Weeks later, the museum released a plain-spoken report: techniques, spectra, and the decision to show the object's layered truth, joining a lineage of scandals that taught institutions hard humility. In a market where a whisper can vaporize fortunes, transparency is the only currency that appreciates with time. The moral question lingers. When a lie is painted over a truth, what deserves saving? The beauty, the lesson, or both?
Don't forget to subscribe to Real Mystery Reports for more strange, dark, and profoundly human stories. New true mysteries every day.